What if the person you loved most, someone you trusted with your heart, decided to test you to see if your love for them was real? What if they disguised themselves as a stranger, a homeless man, and watched how you treat them when they had nothing left to give? Would you still see the person you loved? Or would you walk away, just like everyone else? Ethan Knight is about to find out. And what happens next will change everything. Before we start the story, comment below which city you are watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Ethan Knight stood at the center of the glittering gala, a glass of champagne in his hand, but no joy in his heart. The towering skyscrapers of New York City framed the opulence of the event, where the finest of society had gathered to celebrate their wealth, their connections, their status. Ethan, however, felt nothing but a hollow emptiness as he scanned the crowd, his eyes flickering from one shallow conversation to the next. Laughter echoed all around him. He watched as people smiled, but it was the kind of smile that was polite, practiced, designed to open doors, not hearts. He'd seen it all before. The latest designer dresses, the expensive watches, the names being dropped with practiced ease. It was all a show. It was all about the image. But deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that no one here truly cared about him. No one here saw him for who he truly was, Ethan Knight, the man behind the money. Ethan had everything, or at least he was supposed to. Yet, as he looked around at the glittering guests, he couldn't help but feel more alone than ever before. His mind wandered to Olivia, the beautiful, intelligent woman he had been with for over 3 years. He wanted to believe that their love was real, that she loved him, not just his money. But the more he thought about it, the more the doubt crept in. She had never struggled. She didn't know what it was like to wake up and face a life where everything was handed to you on a silver platter, where your worth was measured by the size of your bank account. Could she really love him for who he was? Or was she just another person caught up in the luxury he provided, the life he'd created? For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure of the answer. A sudden voice broke through his thoughts. It was Zach, his closest friend, who leaned in with a mischievous grin, sensing the dissatisfaction that lingered in Ethan's eyes. "Something's eating at you, man," Zach said, his voice low enough not to be overheard by the nearby socialites. "I can tell." Ethan gave a tight smile, masking the turmoil inside. He didn't want to seem weak in front of Zach, but the truth was, Zach had known him too long to hide it. "It's just all of this," Ethan gestured vaguely to the opulent surroundings. "It doesn't feel real, you know. I don't think anyone here even cares about me. They just want to be close to the money. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Zach raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He had been around Ethan long enough to know that this wasn't the usual complaint. This was deeper, more existential. "What if I told you I have a way for you to find out who really cares?" Ethan glanced at Zach, his curiosity piqued, despite himself. "What do you mean?" Zach leaned in, his voice becoming conspiratorial. "What if you could see, in a completely honest way, how someone would treat you if you had nothing left to give? No money, no status, no luxury, just your raw, vulnerable, and real. If Olivia really loves you, she'll show it even when you're at your lowest. But if she's only interested in your wealth, she'll walk away. You'll see who she really is." Ethan's eyes widened, the idea striking him as both outrageous and intriguing. Could it be that simple? Could he truly test the loyalty of the woman he had given everything to? "Are you saying I should pretend to be homeless?" Ethan asked, a slight laugh escaping his lips, though his tone was more incredulous than amused. Zach shrugged, a playful smirk on his face. "Why not? It's the ultimate test. If she helps you, you'll know she loves you. If she doesn't, well, you'll have your answer." Ethan felt a flicker of both excitement and fear. He had built his entire life on wealth, on the idea that money could buy him respect, admiration, even love. Was he willing to risk everything to find out? "All right," Ethan said, the challenge lighting a spark inside him. Zach laughed, clapping him on the back. "Deal." But don't worry, you'll be surprised by what you find. As Ethan looked around the lavish gala one last time, he felt a sense of urgency rising within him. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what would happen next. But one thing was clear: his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. And it all started with a decision that would put everything to the test. The next morning, Ethan found himself pacing the floors of his penthouse, staring out at the city below. The bright lights of New York stretched out as far as the eye could see, a sea of opportunity and wealth. But for the first time, none of it felt like enough. Ethan couldn't shake the thought. The idea of seeing Olivia's true feelings, of discovering if she loved him for him or for his wealth, had ignited something deep inside him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a matter of pride. The thought of being deceived, of being used, felt like a betrayal. He needed answers. He had to know where Olivia's heart truly lay. He dialed Zach's number, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the call button. Zach answered on the second ring, his voice bright and confident, the same as always. "Ethan, ready to take the plunge?" Zach's tone was teasing, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in it too. He knew how much this meant to Ethan. Ethan's mind raced. "I'm serious about this, Zach. You really think this will work?" Zach's laugh echoed through the phone. "Of course it'll work. You've got to put yourself in a position where she has no idea who you are, no idea what you have. Then you'll see the truth. It's foolproof." "I don't know, man." Ethan hesitated, the weight of the decision settling on him. What if it all goes wrong? What if she gets hurt? Zach's voice softened, more sincere now. "Ethan, I get it. You care about her. But you've been living a life where everything's based on your wealth. This is about stripping all that away and seeing if she'll still care for you. You need to know. You deserve to know." Ethan sighed, his mind finally making up its mind. "All right, I'm in. But we need to make this convincing. I can't just half-ass it." Zach grinned. "That's the spirit. We'll make sure no one recognizes you. The whole point is to test her without any bias, without your status influencing anything. You have to be completely unrecognizable. That's the key." Ethan felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about proving Olivia's loyalty, it was about confronting the emptiness he had felt for so long. Maybe, just maybe, this test would give him the clarity he desperately needed. "All right. Let's do it. I'll call you when I'm ready. Good luck, man." Zach said, with a tone of finality, "You're about to learn more than you think." After hanging up, Ethan stood in the middle of his penthouse, looking around at the luxury that surrounded him. His thoughts turned to Olivia again, her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about their future, the way she had always stood by him. But was it all a lie? Was he just another rich man to her, a stepping stone to a more comfortable life? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. This test would give him the answers. It would reveal the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself in an old thrift shop, staring at racks of tattered clothes. He had taken a few deep breaths before heading out, preparing himself mentally for what was about to happen. His reflection in the mirror told him everything he needed to know this was going to be harder than he thought. He picked out the dirtiest, most worn clothes he could find: an old, faded coat, ragged jeans, and a pair of boots that had seen better days. He spent the next hour perfecting the look, his hair disheveled, his face smeared with dirt from makeup he had applied, and his posture hunched over as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. When he finally stepped out of the store and onto the bustling streets of New York, he felt like a different person. Gone was Ethan Knight, the millionaire businessman. Instead, he was a man with nothing but the clothes on his back, a face full of regret, and a heart filled with uncertainty. As he walked the streets, he kept his head down, careful not to make eye contact with anyone. He knew he would see Olivia at some point. She worked nearby at a cafe. He didn't know when she'd walk past, but he was ready. He had to be. Ethan paused at a busy street corner, watching as people hurried by, lost in their own worlds. He felt invisible. He had never felt more exposed in his life. But that's exactly what he needed. He had to see if Olivia would even notice him. For a moment, a small voice inside him whispered, "What if she doesn't? What if she just walks by like everyone else?" But he shook the thought away. He couldn't back out now. He had already made the choice. The challenge had begun. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Gone was the sharp suit, the polished shoes, the confident businessman ready to conquer the world. In their place was a scruffy, unshaven figure with matted hair, ragged clothes, and eyes that looked tired, worn down by life itself. He barely recognized the man in the glass. He had spent hours putting together the perfect disguise. The thrift store had been a goldmine for shabby clothes that looked as though they had seen better days, if only in a different light. The coat he wore was frayed at the edges, the sleeves long and drooping like they were too big for him. His pants were stained, torn at the knees, with a worn-out look that came only from years. Ethan had spent the past hour applying makeup dirt, smeared across his face, dark circles under his eyes. He had even added a fake scar across his cheek to complete the illusion. As he dabbed the last bit of makeup to create a stubble effect on his chin, he could hardly recognize the person staring back. It wasn't just the clothes that made the transformation complete. It was the hollowed-out look in his eyes, the kind of look that only someone who had lived on the streets for too long would understand. A strange feeling washed over him as he finished his transformation. It was a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Discomfort, because he had never let himself be so vulnerable before, and fascination because, for the first time in a long while, he was seeing himself as a stranger. Was this what Olivia would see if she passed by him on the street? Would she even recognize him? Would she stop, or would she look the other way, pretending not to notice? A surge of dread mixed with guilt rose in his chest. He had no idea how he would feel when he saw her again, if she would walk past him or help. All he knew was that this was his moment of truth, and there was no turning. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a text from Zach. "Ready to put your plan into action?" Ethan stared at the message for a moment. He hadn't realized how nervous he'd become, but he knew he had no choice. He had to go through with it. No more second guessing. He quickly typed back, "On my way." Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his makeshift bag, slung it over his shoulder, and headed out of the penthouse. As he descended in the elevator, the quiet hum of the building felt strangely alien to him. The city outside buzzed with life, yet all Ethan could feel was the overwhelming contrast between his life inside and the one he was about to experience out. When he stepped onto the busy streets of Manhattan, everything felt different. The sound of honking taxis, the chatter of pedestrians, the familiar sights of the city, none of it seemed like it belonged to him anymore. He was just another person on the streets now. Invisible to most, just one of many who passed through the city unnoticed. Ethan walked slowly, letting himself get lost in the crowd. Though part of him felt like he was walking in slow motion, his heart raced with every step. He glanced at the faces around him, but no one seemed to pay him any mind. People walked by, heads down, lost in their own worlds, hurrying to their next destination. No one seemed to care that he existed. He crossed the street, moving toward the cafe where Olivia worked. It was just a few blocks away, and he knew she'd be there soon. His pulse quickened as he got closer, and his breath caught in his throat. This was the moment. This was where he would find out everything. As he neared the corner, he spotted her walking out of the cafe, her head tilted as she chatted with a coworker. She was laughing, completely unaware that the man she was about to encounter was her boyfriend, Ethan. He froze for a moment, watching her smile, so carefree, so full of love. How could he test her like this? He wondered. Was it right to put her in this situation? But before he could dwell on it any longer, Olivia's gaze flickered in his direction. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and he could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of his neck. Would she recognize him? Would she? Olivia hesitated, a frown crossing her face. She paused, her eyes scanning him briefly. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he watched her take in his ragged appearance. For a split second, he saw something. Was it pity? Discomfort? But then she looked away. Without another glance, she continued walking, her laughter fading into the distance. Ethan's stomach twisted in a knot. He had expected her to pass by, but seeing it happen in real time was a gut punch. A sense of validation washed over him, but it was not the kind he had. The feeling that she saw him as nothing more than a stranger was crushed. But as he stood frozen on the corner, watching Olivia walk further away, something unexpected happened. Ethan blinked, not sure if he was imagining it. She turned around and, after a few seconds of hesitation, began walking back toward. His heart began to race once more, but this time it wasn't fear, it was something else entirely. Confusion. Hope. Maybe this wasn't what he thought it was. She approached him slowly, her steps tentative, but when she reached him, she knelt down beside him without a second thought. She looked him in the eyes, her face full of concern, her voice. "Hey, are you okay?" Olivia asked, her hand gently reaching out to touch his shoulder. "I can get you some food, if you're hungry." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the reaction he had expected, not even close. She wasn't walking away. She wasn't looking at him like he was a problem to be ignored. She was treating him like a person. Ethan stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. As Olivia approached him, he could barely believe what was happening. She had actually turned around. But as she sat beside him, her warm hands reaching out to offer food and water, the heavy weight of his own test began to sink. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go into slow motion. Olivia was here, right in front of him, looking at him with a kindness he had never expected from this challenge. Her eyes, full of concern and empathy, were the last thing he had anticipated. But as she spoke softly, trying to make him feel comfortable, the gnawing doubt in Ethan's stomach didn't dissipate. This wasn't the moment he had imagined. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had expected rejection, perhaps even disgust. He had prepared for the worst, expecting her to turn away and walk down the street, leaving him in the dirt with his question unanswered. But instead, she was offering help, a reflection of a woman who saw a person in need, not a test or a game to be won. Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts. "I know it's not much, but I've got a sandwich and a bottle of water. I don't know how long you've been out here, but you don't have to stay hungry." Ethan's throat felt dry, his mouth suddenly too heavy to speak. The words of the bet hung in the air like a shadow. This was the moment he was supposed to watch and analyze. Was this what he wanted? To be the one to test someone he loved? To see if she would help him when he had nothing to offer but his humanity? It felt wrong, so incredibly wrong, and yet he couldn't pull himself out. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to scream out the truth, that he wasn't just any homeless man. But part of him didn't want the test to end so soon. He was afraid of what it would reveal, afraid of his own assumptions, and even more afraid that the truth would shatter everything. Instead, he played the role he had carefully crafted. He mumbled something that sounded like gratitude, taking the sandwich and water she offered with shaky hands, trying to look as downtrodden as he didn't dare make eye contact. Olivia continued to talk, her voice a calming presence in the midst of his storm. "I've seen people in your situation before," she said, her tone soothing but not patronizing. "Sometimes things just don't go the way you expect, and it can be hard, but you're not alone. Everyone deserves a second chance." Ethan's mind raced. Was this her way of making him feel better? Was she trying to make him feel human again? Her words were raw, honest. There was no judgment, no pity, just a genuine desire to ease someone else's. The disconnect between the woman sitting beside him and the wealthy, powerful girlfriend he had been with for years was growing more and more apparent. Ethan couldn't help himself anymore. He glanced up, just for a moment, meeting Olivia's eyes. For a brief second, he saw not a woman judging him, but someone who truly cared. Her gaze wasn't full of pity, it was full of warmth. And then it hit. His stomach churned, and for the first time in days, he felt like he might break. The person he had set up to fail had just shown him more humanity than he had ever seen in his most trusted relationship. The truth was, he had been so wrapped up in his own insecurities and doubts that he had never stopped to ask himself what truly mattered. Had he been so blind to Olivia's true nature? He turned his gaze back to the ground, unsure of what to do next. Should he stay in the disguise a little longer? Should he let the test play out, even though it already felt like a failure? The doubt gnawed at him. His pride, the thing that had kept him afloat through years of success, now felt like a weight that threatened to crush him. Olivia continued to speak, offering more comfort, more kindness, as though nothing in the world mattered except helping someone who needed it. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. As he watched Olivia sit there beside him, offering him hope in the form of food and kindness, something shifted in him. He had been testing her for loyalty, but in doing so, he had completely disregarded the one thing that truly mattered their relationship. The moment felt like a wake-up call. He had been so focused on proving her love for him, on seeing if she would help him in his moment of need, that he had forgotten the most important thing. She was helping him because that's who she was. Not because of the man he appeared to be, but because of the person she was, a person who saw the value in human connection, no matter the circumstances. As Ethan fought back the rising tide of guilt, he knew this test, this challenge, was no longer about Olivia. It was about him. And in that moment, he realized that it was too late to go back. He had crossed the line. This wasn't just a test anymore. He had lost something far more important than his pride. Ethan's heart dropped as Olivia stood up to leave. The comforting words she had offered still echoed in his mind, but they felt distant now. She was turning away, and with each step, the weight of his decision to test her began to feel more like a mistake than a challenge. The smug sense of superiority he had once carried with him was slipping through his fingers. But just as he was about to let the moment pass, something unexpected happened. Olivia paused again. For the briefest of moments, she stood still, her back to him, as if contemplating something. Ethan held his breath, his body tense, waiting. His mind raced, wondering if she had second thoughts. Maybe she was reconsidering everything, the test, the kindness, the betrayal she had just unknowingly given him. Then, without warning, she turned around. Ethan couldn't move. His eyes locked on her as she walked back toward him, each step more purposeful than the last. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her stridently, a quiet resolve that made Ethan feel like the ground beneath him had shifted. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. When she reached him, Olivia didn't pause. She sat down beside him again, her posture open and calm, as if she hadn't just walked away only moments before. She looked at him with the same warmth, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not going to just leave you here," Olivia said softly, her voice laced with an undercurrent of compassion that Ethan hadn't expected to hear. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to feel invisible. So I'm not going to pretend you don't need help, because I see you, even if you don't look like you want to be seen right now." Ethan blinked, stunned by her words. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled sandwich wrapper. "Here, I brought this from work. It's not much, but I thought you might want it." She handed it to him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet but firm sincerity. The cold weight of guilt hit Ethan again, harder this time. It wasn't just that she was showing him compassion, it was that she was doing it without any expectation, without trying to turn it into a grand gesture or some kind of performance. Olivia was simply acting on a deep sense of empathy, treating him with the humanity he had long since forgotten in his privileged world. He could feel the edges of his self-constructed armor cracking. His pride, the very thing that had kept him emotionally distant and always on top, suddenly seemed small, fragile, and utterly pointless. But still, his doubt lingered. He had to know he couldn't just let it go. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia looked at him, her expression soft yet unwavering. "Because I believe people deserve kindness. Because you don't need to have money to be worthy of respect." She paused, her gaze falling on the ground for a moment, before lifting back to meet his. "And because, even if you're pretending to be something you're not, I can see past all that. I'm not here to judge you for how you look or what you have. I'm here because I believe in people." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Olivia didn't see the challenge or the test that Ethan had set for her. She saw only a person in need, and that was enough for her. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The mixture of guilt and awe made it impossible for him to form a coherent thought. Here he was, trying to orchestrate a test to see if Olivia would help him. And yet she had already passed it without even knowing it was a test. He didn't know how to react. Was he supposed to be relieved, ashamed, grateful? Instead, he just sat there, staring at her, his mind reeling. He had expected a cold, calculating response, maybe even anger at the deceit he had orchestrated. But what he had received was the purest form of compassion. A simple, unfiltered kindness that went beyond appearances, beyond the wealth, beyond the role he had cast himself in. Olivia leaned in slightly, looking directly at him. You don't have to be someone else for me to care about you. You just have to be yourself. The words hit Ethan like a wave crashing against the shore. The last remnants of his preconceived notions about her, about how she viewed him, faded away, leaving only the raw truth of the situation. In that moment, he understood. The test wasn't about her at all. It was about him. It had always been about his own insecurities, his inability to trust anyone, especially those closest to him. And now, standing before him, was the woman who had never once shown him anything other than unconditional support, despite the challenges he had placed in her path. The truth became painfully clear. Ethan had misjudged everything. He had placed his worth on material things, on wealth, on status, and in doing so, he had ignored the most important thing: love. Genuine love that came without strings, without expectations. The love Olivia had shown him wasn't because of his money, his looks, or anything superficial. It was because of who he truly was, even if he hadn't been able to see it himself. As the silence between them stretched on, Ethan felt a deep shame flood through him. He had done the unthinkable. He had hurt the person who cared for him most, all for a challenge that, in hindsight, seemed completely unnecessary. The moment stretched on, and all Ethan could do was sit in the discomfort of his own actions, no longer sure of the world he had once thought he understood. Ethan sat there, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the moment bore down on him. The compassion Olivia had shown him, a kindness that cut through his carefully constructed walls, made him feel smaller than he ever had before. The guilt was almost unbearable. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Ethan turned toward Olivia, his throat tight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Olivia, I need to tell you something." She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "What's wrong?" Ethan swallowed hard, the truth about to spill out, regardless of the consequences. He had already crossed the line by deceiving her, but now there was no other choice. He couldn't live with the lie any longer. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice unsteady. "I'm not a homeless man. I'm Ethan Knight, the millionaire businessman you've been dating." The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed frozen, as if the words hadn't quite reached her yet. The reality of the situation seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. You're who?" she asked slowly, almost as if testing herself to hear it again, to make sense of the chaos that had just exploded in front of her. "I'm Ethan Knight," he repeated, his voice now filled with a mix of shame and regret. To know if you loved me for who I am, or just for my wealth." Olivia blinked, her mouth slightly open in shock. Her hands, which had once offered him kindness, now gripped the edges of her seat as she processed the information. She looked at him, then looked away, as if trying to find something to steady her shaking thoughts. The seconds felt like hours as Ethan waited, holding his breath. The realization of his mistake hung heavy in the air, and he couldn't bear the silence anymore. He reached out for her hand, desperate to explain, but she pulled it back sharply. "Why would you do that?" Olivia's voice was shaky, her usually calm demeanor now edged with disbelief and hurt. "Why would you test me like that? Why didn't you just trust me?" Ethan's chest tightened. The questions were simple, but they were the ones that cut the deepest. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he justify using her trust like that? He couldn't. There was no excuse for it. I thought I needed to know, he said quietly, almost to himself. I thought if you helped me, it would prove something about your love for me, but now I see how wrong I was. Olivia shook her head, as if the revelation was too much for her to process. You really think that's what love is? A test? You wanted to test my loyalty by putting me in a situation where I didn't even know what was real. Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had thought he was testing her loyalty, her devotion, but all he had really done was betray her trust, shatter any chance of real connection, and leave her questioning the very foundation of their relationship. I never asked for that, Olivia continued, her voice rising with emotion. I've always supported you. I've always been here because I cared about you. And now you've made me feel like I'm just part of some Gamea game where the stakes were my love and trust. And you're telling me that this was all a test? Ethan's mind spun, his shame deepening with each word she spoke. He had pushed her to a breaking point tone that, no matter how much he wanted to fix it, might never heal. I'm so sorry, he whispered, the words feeling inadequate. I never should have done this. I see now that all I've done is hurt you. I didn't think it would turn out like this. Olivia stood up abruptly, her eyes now filled with a mix of sadness and disbelief. You didn't think it would turn out like this? Ethan, you've ruined everything. I can't believe you would do something like this, to me, of all people. She took a few steps back, her posture now closed off. I thought you were someone I could trust. But now I see, I don't even know who you are anymore. Ethan stood up too, but he felt like he was standing on unstable ground, as if the floor beneath him had given way. He wanted to reach out, to stop her from walking away. But he knew better. He had crossed the line, and no amount of pleading could take back the hurt he had caused. I understand if you want to leave, he said quietly. I didn't know how else to figure this out, but I see now that I don't deserve your trust. Olivia didn't respond immediately. She was standing with her back to him, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice cold and steady. You're right. You don't deserve my trust. And maybe that's the hardest part of all. She turned to face him, her eyes now resolute. I thought you were someone I could build a future with. But now, I realize I can't even trust you to be honest with me. With that, Olivia turned and walked away without another word. Ethan stood frozen, watching her leave, the weight of his mistake sinking in with a painful finality. The hurt in Olivia's eyes lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that he had taken the one thing that mattered most, the trust, and shattered it beyond repair. The man who had once thought he could control everything, who had used his wealth as a tool to test loyalty, now stood empty-handed, realizing that all his money and power meant nothing if he couldn't understand the value of honesty, respect, and love. As the last of Olivia's footsteps faded into the distance, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of loss, a loss he had brought upon himself. Ethan sat alone on the cold, deserted street corner, the echoes of Olivia's footsteps still ringing in his mind. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of everything he had ever believed in was now crushing him under its own immense pressure. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, each one louder than the last. What have I done? The world around him felt distant, as though it was happening in slow motion. The sounds of the bustling city, the honking of taxis, the chatter of people as they passed by, none of it reached him. He was trapped in the silence of his own guilt, the heavy weight of regret pressing down on him like a suffocating force. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt completely and utterly powerless. The money he had accumulated, the success he had worked so tirelessly for, none of it mattered. It wasn't enough to undo the hurt he had caused. It wasn't enough to fill the emptiness that now gnawed at his insides. He had used his wealth to test someone who had loved him unconditionally, and in doing so, he had destroyed the one real thing he had left. He leaned forward, his head in his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. He thought back to the moments when Olivia had helped him, the warmth in her eyes, the care in her voice. She hadn't hesitated for a second to offer him food, to sit by him, to listen to him. She had treated him as an equal, despite the fact that she had no idea who he really was. And then he had betrayed her. He thought of her face when he had revealed the truth. The shock in her eyes, the hurt that replaced the kindness she had once shown him. It was as if he had taken everything from her: the trust, the affection, the connection, and replaced it with a cruel game. And in doing so, he had shown her just how little he valued her as a person, and how much he was willing to sacrifice for his own pride. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. He looked at the screen, and for a split second, his heart skipped a beat as he saw Olivia's name. But then the message appeared. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I can't do this anymore. I thought you were someone I could trust, but now I just can't." The words felt like a dagger, each letter sharp and cold. He stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to react. The message was brief, but it carried with it the finality of everything he had lost. "I can't do this anymore." His thumb hovered over the screen, almost as if he were going to reply, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would undo the damage. He had pushed her away in a way that couldn't be fixed with an apology. The damage wasn't just to their relationship, it was to her, to the very core of who she was. He had manipulated her love, and in return she had walked away, leaving him with nothing. Ethan slammed his fist against the brick wall beside him, the sharp pain a brief distraction from the overwhelming ache in his chest. The anger he felt wasn't directed at Olivia, it was at himself. He had become so wrapped up in his own insecurity, in his need for validation, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had used his wealth, his status, to measure the worth of someone who had already proven, time and time again, that she cared about him for the right reasons. His own arrogance had clouded his judgment, and now he was paying the price. It wasn't just the relationship he had lost. It was something deeper. It was the realization that he had built his entire life around the wrong things, the wrong values, the wrong priorities. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, pushing people away, and testing the loyalty of those closest to him. But in doing so, he had forgotten the most important lesson of all. True connection is built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. Not manipulation, not games. And now, in the wake of his actions, Ethan realized that he had been chasing something that didn't exist, something shallow and empty. The riches, the fame, the admiration of it had meant nothing in the face of real, genuine love. He thought of the way Olivia had looked at him when she offered him that sandwich. The way she had spoken to him, not as a man with money or status, but as a human being. She had seen through all the masks, all the facades, and treated him with kindness, even when he didn't deserve it. It was this realization that struck him like a thunderbolt. His wealth, his status, had never defined him as a person. It was the way he treated others, the way he made them feel, that truly mattered. The silence around him was deafening, and yet, amidst the void of his regret, a thought began to take shape. I can change. I can make this right. It's not too late to fix what I've broken. But deep down, Ethan knew the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't come from buying Olivia back with expensive gifts or grand gestures. It would come from something much harder: earning back her trust, proving that he could be the man she deserved. And that journey, as painful as it might be, had to start now. The days following Olivia's departure felt like an endless blur of empty moments. Ethan tried to fill the silence with the usual distraction-less meetings, his business calls, his lavish dinners with high-powered clients, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. The grand spaces he once navigated with ease now felt hollow and distant. The once appealing sound of clinking glasses and polite conversation became noise, an insufferable reminder that everything he had worked so hard for meant nothing without the one person he had truly cared about. He kept his phone close, hoping, though deep down he knew better, that Olivia would reach out. Maybe with an apology, maybe with a message that would offer him a sliver of hope, a chance to make things right. But the silence remained. No texts, no calls, no emails. The gap between them grew wider by the day, a canyon of hurt and disappointment he had created. Every time he walked into the penthouse, the emptiness of the space hit him harder. Her laughter, her presence, the way she'd arranged the flowers on the kitchen counter, these little things that once filled his life with warmth, now seemed like painful reminders of the love he had taken for granted. In one moment of desperation, he even had one of his assistants track her down. He needed to talk to her. He needed to explain himself, to beg for forgiveness. But when he finally stood in front of her after what seemed like endless attempts to find the right moment, Olivia didn't even let him finish his sentence. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type juice if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. You've said enough, she said coldly, her voice distant and firm. Her eyes, once filled with affection, now held nothing but an ocean of hurt and resolve. She folded her arms tightly, as if shielding herself from the rawness of the situation. There's nothing more for us to say, Ethan. Ethan's heart sank, and he reached out instinctively, as if trying to touch the last threads of their connection. But she took a step back. Her eyes flickered with something close to sadness, but it was tinged with finality. You tested me, Olivia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. You used me, Ethan, and you thought that would be okay because you have money. But trust doesn't work that way. You can't buy it. You can't manipulate it. You either have it or you don't, and clearly you didn't. The words struck him like a physical blow, each one chipping away at his sense of self. She was right, of course, but hearing it from her, the person he had once thought he could trust more than anyone, made it feel real in a way nothing else ever had. I'm sorry, he choked out, his voice breaking with the weight of his remorse. I didn't think it through. I never meant to hurt you. But Olivia shook her head, her expression softening, but her resolve unshaken. I can't do this anymore, Ethan. You don't get to control my feelings, my love. I'm not here to be part of a game. I was here for you. Not for what you could give me, not for your wealth, not for your title. But you were never really here for me, were you? Her words echoed in his mind as she turned and walked away, each step pulling her further out of his life. He felt utterly powerless, watching her go, unable to stop her from walking out of the door he had just opened wide for her. He stood there for a long while, not moving, as if frozen in place by the enormity of the moment. Her rejection wasn't just the end of their relationship, it was a stark, painful realization that he had lost more than Olivia. He had lost the trust of the one person who had ever seen past his wealth, past the facade, and loved him for who he truly was. He had taken that love and thrown it away on a selfish whim. The realization hit him in waves. The life he had built, the lifestyle that once felt so fulfilling, now seemed empty. Money, success, power, it was all useless in the face of real love. The things he thought he wanted had ultimately been a distraction from the one thing that truly mattered. For days, Ethan sat in the silence of his penthouse, wrestling with the emptiness. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. He had betrayed her trust, manipulated her feelings, and in doing so, had stripped away the only real connection he had left. He tried to immerse himself in his work, throwing himself into deals and contracts, hoping that the grind would numb the pain. But nothing could fill the void. His office was no longer a place of triumph. It felt like a cage. His fortune seemed meaningless. And then there were the nights, the long, lonely nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of Olivia's face burned into his mind. She had trusted him, loved him, and now she was gone. Ethan had always been someone who believed that success could solve anything, that with enough money, power, and influence, everything could be bought, fixed, or manipulated into place. But as he stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city that once made him feel invincible, he realized how utterly wrong he had been. It wasn't the city lights that brought him comfort anymore. It was the quiet, the stillness, that now seemed to offer him the space to think. And in the silence of his own mind, he faced the truth he had been avoiding. His life, the one he had carefully constructed, was built on a foundation of shallow lies, and it had cost him everything he held dear. I've ruined everything. Olivia's face haunted him, her kindness, her empathy, the way she had looked at him not as a millionaire businessman, but as a man who was flawed, vulnerable, and in need of real connection. He had betrayed that trust, and now she was gone. Not just from his life, but from his heart. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Nothing he had ever worked for mattered without love, without real human connection. It wasn't about the billions in his bank account, the prestigious meetings, or the fancy cars. What he had lost wasn't just Olivia, it was himself. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the floor, knowing that redemption wasn't going to come from more wealth, more deals, or more achievements. It would only come from one thing: genuine change. He had made Olivia a pawn in his ego-driven game. And now, it was time to put aside that pride. He reached for his phone and sent out a series of messages he had put off for years. Messages he had avoided because they required vulnerability and accountability. To the people he had wronged, to those who had worked for him and with him, whose loyalty he had taken for granted. "I'm sorry. I've been selfish and blind. I haven't treated you with the respect you deserve, and I want to make it right." He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. But he had to try. He had to begin somewhere. As days passed, Ethan found himself dedicating his time to something entirely new: charity. He had long thought of his wealth as a tool for personal gain, but now he began to see it for what it truly was: an opportunity to give back, to help the people who had been neglected, overlooked, or forgotten. He made significant donations to shelters for the homeless, starting with those who had been forced to live on the streets, those, like the person he had pretended to be. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once looked down on the very people he now sought to help. But it wasn't just about the money. Ethan made it his mission to become hands-on in local shelters, working with people who had lost everything, trying to help them rebuild. He spent time listening to their stories, offering support, and giving them the dignity that had once been denied to him. He began working with organizations that focused on the homeless, mental health, and food insecurity. For the first time, he saw the world in a different light. The more he gave, the more he understood just how far-reaching the impact of his wealth could be, but also how little it could actually help someone who had lost their sense of hope. Ethan's actions weren't grandiose. He wasn't doing this for the cameras or for recognition. There were no headlines or social media posts about the good he was doing. It wasn't about that. It was about proving to himself and, hopefully, to Olivia that he could change, that he wasn't the same arrogant man who had tested her love. In one of his darkest moments, he received an unexpected text from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. It was a short message, but it was enough to stir something inside him. "I've been watching the changes you've made. You're doing the right thing, Ethan. But don't forget, redemption doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and trust. Trust is earned." The words stung, but they also sparked something deeper. Ethan knew he wasn't going to change overnight. He wasn't going to wake up one morning and find everything fixed. But at least now, he was on the right path. He was finally taking responsibility for his actions, not because he wanted something in return, but because he truly wanted to be better. And though the road to redemption would be long and painful, Ethan was beginning to understand that it was the only path worth walking. Months passed, and with each new day, Ethan continued his quiet journey of self-improvement. He had stopped seeking external validation. The lavish galas, the expensive cars, the endless business meetings, they no longer held the same appeal. The more he focused on meaningful work, on genuine connections with people who had nothing to offer him but their trust and stories, the more he realized that his life was finally beginning to feel full, not because of what he could take. And in his heart, he still held on to the faint hope that one day Olivia would see the man he was becoming, not the arrogant, rich businessman who tested her love, but someone who had learnt from his mistakes. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Ethan was volunteering at a local shelter, helping serve lunch to a group of homeless veterans, he got a message. It was from Olivia. "Can we talk?" His heart skipped a beat. It had been months since he last saw her, since their painful goodbye. But even as excitement rushed through him, he knew this moment would be different. This wasn't about apologizing for the past. This was about showing Olivia the man he had become. He quickly replied, agreeing to meet at a quiet cafe that had once been their favorite spot. As he waited for her, every second felt like an eternity. The nervousness he once knew so well when he was playing the role of a wealthy businessman, with all the charm and bravado as now replaced with something much deeper. Vulnerability. He wasn't sure if Olivia was coming to offer him another chance. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't be the same person he once was. He had to prove that to her, and most importantly, prove it to himself. When she walked in, the world seemed to stop for a moment. She looked just as beautiful as he remembered, though there was a guardedness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A kind of caution, as though she were waiting for something, maybe for him to slip back into the same old patterns, the same manipulative games. Olivia hesitated for a moment before taking a seat. She studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something deeper. Ethan knew what she was doing. She was weighing his sincerity, and he couldn't blame her. After everything, she had every right to be cautious. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. It was the same voice that had once filled his life with warmth, but now it felt distant, as if there were a great chasm between them. "Hi," Ethan replied, his voice full of emotion. He tried to smile, but the words he had been rehearsing for months seemed to escape him. The weight of everything he had done, the hurt he had caused, the trust he had shattered was almost too much to bear. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Olivia spoke again, her voice tinged with skepticism, but also something like hope. "So what's this all about, Ethan? Why did you want to meet?" Ethan took a deep breath. He had been preparing for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the weight of her words. "I wanted to show you, Olivia, that I've changed, that I'm not the man I was before. I've been working on myself, on becoming someone who's worthy of your trust, of your love. I've spent the last few months trying to undo the damage I caused, trying to prove to myself that I can be better than the arrogant businessman who tested you." Olivia's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't speak. She simply listened, taking in every word. Ethan continued, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders as he finally spoke the truth he had buried for so long. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't expect it to be easy. But I want you to know that I've learnt, Olivia. I've learned that love isn't something you can test or control, it's something you earn. And I'm ready to work for it. Not for your approval, not for your affection, but for the chance to be someone better. For me." A long silence followed. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what Olivia's response would be. He had said everything he needed to say, but there was still the question that lingered in the air. Was it enough? Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "I can see that you've changed, Ethan, and I can see that you're trying, but that doesn't mean I can forget what happened. You betrayed my trust in the worst way possible. And trust, once it's broken, takes a long time to rebuild." Ethan nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know, and I don't expect you to jump back into anything, not without trust. But if you're willing, I want to start over with honesty. No tests, no games, just us, the way it should have been from the beginning." For a moment, it seemed like she was going to walk away, that she was going to reject him once more. But then, a flicker of something hope maybe passed across her face. Slowly, she leaned forward, her hands folded in front of her. "You're right. Trust is earned, and it's going to take time, but maybe we can start with a clean slate. Maybe we can try again, but it has to be real, no more pretending." Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. It wasn't going to be easy, but this was the beginning of something new. They both knew that rebuilding their relationship wouldn't be instantaneous. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was moving forward, not in the way he had always imagined, with wealth and status, but in the way that truly mattered, with sincerity, love, and a commitment to change. Time, as it always does, moved forward. The weeks turned into months, and Ethan's life slowly took on a new rhythm. that was grounded not in his material wealth, but in the relationships he was rebuilding. He no longer spent his days buried in boardrooms or luxury events. Instead, his mornings started with quiet reflection, followed by visits to shelters and local community centers. His nights were spent working with organizations that supported those in need, from the homeless to people struggling with addiction, mental health issues, and food insecurity. Every day, he found new ways to make a positive impact. But despite all the changes Ethan was making, there was one thing that weighed most heavily on his heart: Olivia. He had never stopped loving her, but the distance between them was still there, the trust still fragile. Their relationship was still in its infancy. They had shared a few casual dinners and spent time really talking about their feelings, their past, and their hopes for the future. There were no grand gestures, no fancy dates, just quiet moments where they learnt about each other again. Olivia had made it clear that her trust in him had to be earned, and Ethan had no problem with that. He was willing to wait, for as long as it took. One evening, a chilly breeze whispered through the trees as they sat on the park bench, their fingers brushing gently but lingering for a moment. It was a simple moment, but to Ethan, it felt like everything. For the first time, they were sharing something real, something that didn't require wealth or status to sustain it. "You've come a long way, Ethan," Olivia said. She had always been the strong one, the one who could see through the surface and into the heart of things. "I'm just getting started," Ethan replied, his voice steady. He had spent so much of his life chasing the wrong things. But now, he was chasing something more meaningful: the chance to prove that he could be the man Olivia had always seen in him, even when he hadn't believed it himself. "I know," she said with a small smile, "and I'm proud of you, but just know that you'll always have to prove yourself not to me, but to yourself." Ethan nodded. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. The real victory had already been won. The man he had been was gone, and the man he had become was here to stay. A man who understood the value of compassion, honesty, and love. As the season turned, the two of them grew closer. Ethan's transformation was not just in his actions, but in the way he saw the world. No longer driven by pride or ego, he learned to truly listen to the people around him. And in doing so, he realized that life wasn't about building walls to protect his wealth or image. It was about tearing down those walls to let in the very things he had once dismissed: human connection, trust, and love. Eventually, after a year of rebuilding, Ethan and Olivia took the next step in their relationship. This time, it wasn't about him pulling the strings or testing her loyalty. It was about creating something built on honesty, mutual respect, and understanding. They began to build a future together, not as two separate people, but as partners with shared values. And while Ethan had always been a millionaire, it was only now that he understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about luxury. It was about the richness that came from helping others, from living with integrity, and from cultivating relationships that were real and lasting. Together, they focused on causes that mattered to theme education, homelessness, and mental health, accessing their resources to make a difference in ways that were meaningful. They started projects that directly impacted the lives of those who had once been invisible to them. Those people Ethan had walked past, assuming they were nothing more than a reflection of his own indifference. Their work together gave them both a sense of purpose far greater than any financial success ever could. They weren't just making money, they were making lives better. And in doing so, they found the fulfillment they had always been searching for, but had never known how to find. And as they looked out over the skyline of New York City, sitting side by side on a quiet rooftop, Ethan finally understood something that had always eluded him. True wealth comes from the heart. For the first time, Ethan felt complete, not because of the wealth he had amassed, but because of the life he had created. A life grounded in love, redemption, and the power to change. Do you think Ethan was right to test Olivia's loyalty the way he did? Or did he go too far? Could you forgive someone who betrayed your trust like that? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to stay updated with all our stories. And check out more exciting ones by clicking here on the end screen.